Hello and welcome to my Nutrient Nirvana YouTube channel. Today we are joined once again by my favourite historical researcher and author, Ralph Ellis. In our last show together, we covered Ralph's 3 books on the historical Jesus Christ, Cleopatra to Christ, King Jesus, and Jesus King of Edessa. In those 3 books, Ralph manages to resolve the greatest intellectual mystery and global quest of the last 2 millennia: the true origins of Christianity and the identification of the historical Jesus, King Isas Manu of Edessa, or King Jesus Emmanuel of Edessa. In today's show, we're going to focus on Ralph's final book in this 4-part trilogy, The Grail Cipher. In this book, Ralph delves very deeply into the King Arthur mystery. So, who was King Arthur? Is he just a mythical character, or was he a real king or a chieftain warrior? Is there any truth to the popular portrayal of Arthur as a Dark Ages character? And is there any validity in the legend of Joseph of Arimathea planting hawthorn trees and preaching the Gospels in Glastonbury, Somerset in the 1st century AD? Ralph, a very warm welcome back to my channel.
Good to be with you, Paul. Thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure. So, where shall we get started with this story, Ralph?
Well, I suppose how I got into it in the first place. I mean, this is not my field, Arthurian legend. I came to this because I kept seeing elements of Arthurian history as I was going through 1st century history in Judea, the gospel story. And I kept seeing pointers that were pointing towards Arthurian type information and legend. Because, of course, one of the prime characters of Arthurian legend is Joseph of Arimathea, 1st century character from Judea. And that's a bit of a problem. Why is King Arthur linked to Joseph of Arimathea? That's a bit strange, isn't it, for starters? Well, I didn't actually know very much about Arthurian legend at that point. Probably like yourself, I'd just seen the films, read a few popular stories, and that was about it, really. It's about as far as most people go. And so we don't have a very good grounding in the Arthurian story because like my work with the gospel story, the story is not as is told. So we have this overview of the gospel story, which is as far from removed from reality as it's possible to get. And we have the same problem with King Arthur, because we have this idea about this Arthurian character, Dark Age king, possibly Welsh, certainly British, fighting against Saxons, maybe fighting against Romans. Not sure how that works in the Dark Ages, but there we go. Who was this guy? And as soon as I started investigating it, I knew that there was problems with the classical story because he's not there in the historical record. So the earliest we can go back is Gildas, who I suppose is 6th century. So he's almost actually of the time of King Arthur, but he never mentions King Arthur, not once. Then we go up to the Venerable Bede. He's sort of 8th century, I suppose, and he doesn't mention Arthur, not once. So the 2 of the earliest chroniclers from the British Isles in that early era do not mention King Arthur.
Do they allude to the stories of King Arthur in any way at all?
They allude to some of the sub-characters who are involved in the Arthurian story.
Right.
But there is no Arthurian story. You think of what the Arthurian story is. It's Arthur, it's Guinevere, it's the court, it's Camelot, it's the Round Table. That is the story of Arthur. None of that is visible up until the 8th century. Well, in fact, beyond. All we get, even as far as Nennius. So Nennius is also 8th century, I think. No, 9th century. There was a chronicle by someone that was known as Nennius. And he at last mentions an Arthur. but he's just a dux bellorum. He's just a Duke of War. He's not a king, and there is no court. There is no Camelot. There is none of the Arthurian story there. There's just this mention of a warlord who might be called Arthur. Same in the Welsh Chronicles as well. We get this one line, I think it is, one line mention of an Arthur who happens to be a warrior of some nature. And I think actually delving deeper into this later on, this mention of an Arthur is simply an alternative name for Hercules. And so Hercules had this, he gained this title of Arthur later on. And he was the warrior hero who was going to help you in battle, etc. He was Hercules. And I think he gained the name Arthur at some point. But there is no Arthurian story there. And then we come up to William of Malmesbury. Now we're up to the 12th century. You know, we're coming up to 1125. The first book by Malmesbury, Chronicle of the English Kings, does not mention King Arthur. Again, we have some of the periphery items that are to do with the Arthurian story. But there is no mention of the Arthurian story there. Henry of Huntingdon is quite a good, actually, chronicle of, it's a history of the English, I think it's called. Again, 12th century, 1130. And he does not mention the Arthurian story. So, you know, we're 500-600 years beyond King Arthur, and we still don't have this story. Nobody knew about him. And then finally, we come to Geoffrey of Monmouth and Walter of Oxford, 1135. So again, we're 12th century. And suddenly, we get the entire Arthurian story. Pretty much everything there, except for the Round Table. And Lancelot. He has a different name. But we get the full story. We get the, you know, Arthur, the court, the Camelot, the Guinevere, knights not of the Round Table, but the knights questing deeds, battling with the Saxons, battling with the Romans. Not sure how that happens in the Dark Ages, because there were no Romans in Britain, of course, at that time. And this Arthur goes off and conquers the Roman Empire. Goes off to Rome. And that story just jumps out of nowhere. And we have to ask ourselves, why did that happen all of a sudden? And then, of course, we come beyond that. William of Newburgh writes a very good chronicle. His was the history of the English affairs. And again, it's a very good chronicle of England and Britain in those days. He's 1160s, so we're talking about, 25 years after Monmouth and Oxford. And he ridicules this idea of the King Arthurian story. And he says there's no evidence. And more than that, how on earth can you keep the deeds of this valiant and well-known king secret? He equates him to Alexander the Great. How could anyone keep the deeds of Alexander the Great secret for 600 years? It's just nonsensical. So William of Newburgh ridicules the whole idea of Arthurian legend only 25 years after it was written. And he's right, because there was no evidence whatsoever for this character for 600 years before Monmouth and Oxford wrote about it. And those two stories are linked, of course. Monmouth is the famous one that everybody knows, Geoffrey of Monmouth. But his manuscript came from Normandy. It wasn't a British chronicle. It came from Normandy or Brittany. That's what they say in the book. And they got this manuscript and they turned it into this story. And it was given to Monmouth and Oxford. So we have Walter of Oxford, who writes a much more prosaic and believable story than Monmouth. So Monmouth writes this wonderful fantasy story about King Arthur, whereas Walter of Oxford just gives the bare bones of the facts of the story, and it's quite readable actually. And it's obviously from the same manuscript. It's the same story. They follow each other all the way through. So we have these two stories which came out of northern France, didn't come from Britain. And suddenly we get this Arthurian story in 1135. And that's maybe a clue as to what's gone on here, because we're into the era of the Crusades. And the other problem with the Arthurian story is, why is it not a British story? So this story is not British, although everyone thinks it is. They think it's Welsh, they think it's Celtic, they think it's British, whatever. It's not. And there are no Arthurian legends from Britain up until Thomas Malory, who was not until, when was he? It was nearly 15th century, certainly 14th century. And he says so in his introduction. So in Thomas Malory from Mort de Arthur, he says, for in all places, Christian and heathen, King Arthur is reputed. He is more spoken of beyond the sea, more books made of his noble acts than there be in England, as well as in Dutch, Italian, Spanish, Greek, and French. So the only reason he wrote Mort de Arthur was because he couldn't find a British copy of the Arthurian story. And that's another problem for the classical idea of what King Arthur is. And here's another one. Where do we find the earliest sculptures and mosaics of King Arthur? So where would they be? Tintagel? Glastonbury? Camalodunum? No, they're all in Italy. And they're early. I mean, these are 12th, 11th century. We're going back to the very beginning of Arthurian legend here. So they're 1150s. Right at the beginning of Arthurian legend, when Monmouth and Oxford were writing their manuscript. And they're all in Italy. So there's one in Modena Cathedral, which is in northern Italy. We've got one in Bari Cathedral, that's down in the south of Italy. And we've got a mosaic down there, or Otranti, I think it's called, if I get the pronunciation correct. Again, down in the south of Italy, we have a mosaic of King Arthur, very early, 1150s AD. So why do we have this concentration of the Arthurian legend across all of Europe, especially in Italy, and not in other places, especially in northern France as well? Of course, it's a big Norman story. And not in Britain, when this guy was supposed to be a British king. It's a bit of a problem. But of course, this links up again with the Crusades, because southern Italy was ruled at that time by King Roger. Now, King Roger was a Norman. So we have this link here between Norman north of France, where this story came from, and Norman Italy, because the Normans had taken over southern Sicily and southern Italy. So Sicily and southern Italy were ruled by the Muslims up until the end of the 10th century, until he became King Roger, went down there with his Norman knights and ejected all of the Muslims from Sicily and southern Italy. And he became King Roger I of Italy. And the story, of course, dates from his era in southern Italy. So we have a link here with Normans and the Crusades that were going on at the time in the Near East. So that is the big conundrum with Arthurian legend. And we have other problems as well. So, yeah, I was just going to read out actually some of the other Arthurian stories here. So the Scottish Arthur is Roman de Fergus. The Italian one is Florent and Florette. The Norman ones, well, we have Percival and from Chrétien de Tours and so on. The German one, of course, they have one, very famous, Parzival. Wolfram von Eschenbach, a very good story. And he's, of course, linked with France as well, in southern France, because he wrote the history of King William of Orange, the Prince of Orange, which I talk about in my book, Mary Magdalene, Princess of Orange. We had this independent enclave was set up in the south of France around the city called Orange, and it became the Principality of Orange. It's still there today, of course, although it's not independent. And if you trace the sort of history of Mary Magdalene, it's sort of likely that Mary Magdalene ended up in Orange, and her sister Martha went to Tarascon, which was next door to Orange, next town up. And there's this big tradition that Martha was in Tarascon and she fought the Tarasque, this fearsome beast. And this fearsome beast in Tarascon, it's a Glyptogon. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. If you remember, it's a prehistoric animal that looks like an armadillo, except it's an armadillo that's like 4 meters long. You know, it's a huge. But that's basically what it is. And they've got this big statue in this sculpture in the middle of the town of this huge great Glyptogon, which was the fearsome beast that Martha of Bethany was supposed to have tamed. So there's a big tradition of them being in the south of France there, of course. And from that very same location, we ended up with the Princes of Orange. And of course, the Princes of Orange, their name comes from or, meaning gold. So they were the golden royalty. And of course, that's probably quite so. A, because they were probably linked to solar worship, gold in that sense, and also because they were ginger-haired. And we go back to my links here where, you know, the family of Jesus were all ginger and so on. I've been proving this in many of my books. I don't think this has ever been mentioned before. For some reason, everyone has shied away from this. And even, you know, proper scholarly books, proper sort of histories from, you know, reputable television companies and so on. And they'll always try and portray the sort of Jesus family as being olive-skinned, typical Middle Easterners. But of course, that's not necessarily typically Middle Eastern. If you look at Yaqubi, who's supposed to be the, what does he call himself? The 35th ancestor descendant of Muhammad. He lives in Syria at present, so he's quite revered. And he's Scottish, basically. He's white and ginger. Very, very, very ginger, as Scottish as you can possibly imagine. And he's supposed to be the 25th or 35th descendant from Muhammad, and he's ginger. And when I was in those parts in Syria, there are still quite a number of gingers knocking around that area. But of course, the pharaohs of Egypt were also ginger. So,
Ralph, can I just interject there? Were the Tudors of England were ginger as well, weren't they?
All of them, yeah.
Is there any connection there at all?
Well, it remains to be seen. I have made the connection. I've not proved any connection, but we did have the exodus of these ginger monarchs on many occasions. So we had the exodus of Queen Scota, and in my book, Scota, Egyptian Queen of the Scots. And this comes from Scottish history and Irish history, going back to the 6th century. I mean, this is quite an early history. And the Scottish history dates from the 14th century. And it's called Scotti Chronicon. And it details, in quite a lot of detail, the exodus of a royal family out of Egypt who went to Spain. So they went to Hiberia, and then they went to Hibernia. They got the same name. So they went from Spain, they went to Ireland, and Ireland at that time was called Hibernia, a name that's now been transferred to Scotland. And they settled in Ireland on the Dingle Peninsula, and then later they went to Scotland. And this is a very ancient history. Everyone says it's mythology, but I have an idea myself that it's more history than mythology, because there is a number of similarities that might back up this story that, you know, this royal family came out of Egypt. And one of those aspects of them is this royal family was ginger.
Have they not proved that there's, I think it was Ramesses, was it? The mummy of Ramesses. It was proved recently that he had ginger hair.
Yeah, that was actually back in the 80s. So they noticed his mummy was infested with some sort of animal. Some little insect had got in. And so they took his mummy to Paris for preservation. And it went to the Paris forensic labs for preservation. And it was investigated by Pierre Calcaldi, who was the chief forensic scientist in Paris. And he determined that Ramesses II, this is Ramesses the Great, was a light-skinned ginger hair.
Wow.
And you can tell it's ginger hair because lots of people say, oh, well, you know, it's just the mummification process. Well, no, the chemicals involved are entirely different. The chemicals in your hair that make them ginger are distinct. They're nothing like the chemicals used for mummification. They're based on menolin, basically. There's two types. I forget what they're called now. There's two types of menolin, which determine skin color, but they also determine your hair color as well. And the different blends of those two, and you end up with a ginger hair. And so he was determined forensically as being ginger. Yuya was ginger. Yuya was the patriarch of the Amarna dynasty of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And both Akhenaten and Nefertiti would have been descended in some aspects from Yuya. Yuya and Thuyu, I think his wife was called. And those two characters have been identified. If you look at the works of Ahmed Osman, those two characters have been identified as being the biblical Joseph.
Okay, can I just speculate something here? I don't know if you've ever come across a book written by an Irish author around 100 years ago called Irish Wisdom Preserved in the Pyramids and the Bible.
Yeah, there's been a few like that. There was one written recently by, I forget his name. Why should I forget his name? Michael Tsarion.
Oh yeah, yeah, I know Michael Tsarion. Yeah,
he wrote one a decade or so ago about the Irish preserving the history during the Dark Ages, which did the same sort of thing. It linked up back with Egypt again. There have been quite a few books on that theme, saying there was a link between Ireland and Egypt.
I think Conor McDarry was asserting that there was a great Irish empire and civilization prior to the pyramid era of Egypt. And
that's been,
yeah, go on, sorry.
That's been said on a few occasions. I don't agree with that. There's a lot of pro-Celtic peoples that are saying that to this day. I rather think it went the other way. So the whole history of Scoticronicon is that when the reason they went to Ireland is because it was relatively empty. So it was an uninhabited, well, it wasn't uninhabited, but there was a very rudimentary civilization there, which was easily dominated. Because when they were in Spain, they settled first on the Ebro Peninsula on the east coast of Spain. They were continuously being attacked by people who were relatively sophisticated peoples and were difficult to fight off. And as it says in the book, we always won every battle, but during every battle, we always lost a few people. Mm. And of course, they didn't have any people to lose because they were only I speculate 1,000 people or so to start with. They had 60 ships, I think, when they sailed off from Egypt. So they were requested to leave. This was another exodus. And it's probably quite true. I traced this exodus back to Pharaoh I and his wife Ankhesenamun. So Pharaoh I was one of the chief ministers of the Amarna regime of Akhenaten, and he became the pharaoh after Tutankhamun. So he took control after Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun went back to the old gods. Well, he was told to go back. Of course, he was only a child, of course, and he probably didn't have much say in it. He went back to the old gods of Amun instead of the Aten. But then Pharaoh I came in, who had been the previous military commander and minister of the Amarna regime, and returned the religion to the Aten again. But then he got driven out as well. And the question is, where did he go to? Was he killed? Did he go on an exodus? Well, the Scoticronicon story says that he went on an exodus. And he was given the choice of, you either die or you go on an exodus. And he was given 60 ships to go and sail off wherever he liked to. And so it was a controlled and organized exodus where he could load up 60 ships with obviously his courtiers and supporters and whoever, and as much, as they required, and just go. And they sailed off to the west somewhere. And I follow their route through that they settled in Spain. They set up a small nation in Spain. They were continuously attacked. So they went to the Balearic Islands, which were supposedly empty at the time, and set up a civilization on the Balearic Islands, Mallorca, Menorca. Mm-hmm. And then eventually they sailed round to Ireland and set up a small civilization there, landing on the Dingle Peninsula. But then, of course, we have this story, and of course they say that, most of Ireland was, pretty much empty at the time, of this red-haired royalty arriving in Ireland. And this could have been, they would have left Egypt in 1320-ish BC. So this is pretty early in terms of recorded civilization. So they would have been in Spain at that time, and then I think they moved on to Ireland several generations later. But even, we're talking something like 1000 BC or so. They could have been turning up in Ireland and Scotland. So it's quite early, and early enough to seed Northern Europe with a lot of gingerheads. None of that is proven, but there's quite a lot of interesting similarities between the cultures and the artifacts that they left in those regions. We have these truncated round towers. We have these upturned boat tombs in the Balearics and in Ireland and so on. There's a lot of similarities there that indicate this might have happened. Nothing proven, of course, but it's an interesting topic as to how this ginger phenotype might have ended up in the north. Because we know that the pharaohs all the way from Yuya through to Ramesses the Great were ginger. Cleopatra was ginger. Jesus was ginger. And we have this from my identification of the Huqaq mosaic, which I think we talked about that, didn't we?
We did, yeah.
The Huqaq mosaic is interesting because whether you agree with my identification that this was Jesus, he most certainly was an Edessan king because he was the leader of the Jewish revolt, and that's what the Talmud says. And he's ginger. So whoever this king was, and he's got to have been a king of Edessa, even if you don't agree with the Jesus identification, he is a ginger king from the 1st century in Judea and Syria.
And didn't Muhammad dye his hair ginger?
He did. That's why if you look on the internet and you just dial in ginger Muslim, you will see all of these tribal Muslims around, Afghanistan and northern India and Pakistan, whatever. They all dyed their hair ginger. Why? Because they want to look like Muhammad. Because Muhammad had ginger hair.
And why did Muhammad dye his hair ginger?
Well, I think it was naturally ginger anyway, because there are in the Hadith there are several comments about this, and 2 of the comments say he dyed his hair ginger, and 2 of the comments say that his hair was ginger anyway. So he was probably ginger and probably went white as age crept up on him. So he dyed it ginger. It was probably a symbol of his, to be ginger. So he dyed it with henna later on when he was getting older, I think. But the evidence is, and certainly the tradition is within Islam, that Muhammad was ginger. And that may well be so, because there was this strand of ginger that ran through these monarchies in this early era. It was probably how they could identify themselves and keep their bloodlines pure, ginger and ginger, and they always married in the family. They were always having incestuous relationships, as did Jesus as well, of course. In my books, I say that he married his sister, so Mary Magdalene would have been his sister. But that's what all of these monarchies did. Even Agrippa II did that with his sister, who was Berenike. He wasn't officially married to her, but he had an incestuous relationship with his sister, because that's what these monarchies did in this early era. So, yeah, we've sort of drifted off our theory.
That's my fault. Apologies.
That's all right. Don't worry. It was an interesting discussion. We don't mind.
No, I think you were talking about Arthur and the various names that he has around Europe prior to.
Yes. Yeah, with the various manuscripts that were written about him, and one of those, of course, that's how we got into this story. One of them was by Wolfram von Eschenbach, and he wrote about Arthurian legend, but he also wrote the history of the Princes of Orange when they were in southern France, before they moved to Holland. So, of course, that's the same monarchy, are now in Holland, and they are the Princes of Orange in Holland, and of course they are ginger. All of the Princes of Orange were and still are ginger. So there we have the same strand of ginger going through that family as well. And oh yes, some of the other heresies of Arthurian legend. So one of the other big heresies is where this story came from, and who was central to it. And where should we start this? Well, one of the big heresies is that Arthurian legend is not as advertised. So we always think about Monmouth and Oxford and that standard story that they always give us from Geoffrey of Monmouth. Well, that is only 5% of Arthurian legend. The great bulk of it comes from the other manuscripts from around Europe, and then from the Vulgate cycle. And the Vulgate cycle is 9 volumes, about 5,000 pages of Arthurian legend. Impenetrable, very interesting. And it's like a haystack with, one or two very exciting needles stuck in it somewhere, and you've got to go hunting for these needles because it's not obvious, and it's not the same story as Monmouth and Oxford. So later on, as people grew in confidence about the Arthurian story, because I say it was set up as a way of preventing you from being burnt at the stake, basically, because the story was heretical. We'll come on to this in a minute. This is why they told this story. And later on, they got a bit more confident and started telling some different parts of this story. And so we get things like high history, which is a very dark version of Arthurian legend, where King Arthur is the most evil king in the whole world. Very, very different story. It's written obviously by someone who was on the other side of this story, wanted to give a different opinion. And it's based on Christianity because some of the aspects within it, so the woman who is flayed by her husband, and then her husband sticks a spear through her chest. She is supposed to be Jesus. Of course, Jesus was flayed and then had a spear stuck in his side and so on. So you get all these strange allusions to Christianity, and you get mockery of Christianity as well, which you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So they had this pious king who boiled his son and cut pieces of meat off his son and gave them to all of the congregation, and therefore he had to be a good king because he boiled his son. And you think, well, hold on a minute. This is the
Eucharist.
Christian, yes, the Christian Eucharist, but it's making a mockery of the Christian Eucharist. And so you get all of these sort of things that pop up in the middle of this story, which give a very different idea of what it's all about. And then, of course, in high history and in history of the Holy Grail, we get this weird illusion that the original story that was given to the author who wrote this, the original story was written by Josephus Flavius. Now, that's a problem. Josephus Flavius was the 1st century historian of Judea. And he is supposed to be the original author of Arthurian legend. And that's a problem. And a lot of the researchers who did look into this, a lot of modern researchers don't even get that far, so they don't even see this. But some of the old researchers, like William Nietzsche, who did a very good analysis of Arthurian legend, said, well, this is obviously a mistake, this cannot be. And so he just moved on, and that was it. It was a mistake. But what if it isn't a mistake? Because there are other illusions as well. So in one of the histories, Percival, who I say is Galahad. So Galahad is a title, and we'll come on to the galleys in a minute.
It just means the Welshman, doesn't it?
It means the eunuch. This is the whole problem, that you can translate these manuscripts in different fashions depending on what sort of angle you're coming from. And the Galleys were a very famous sect in Judea in the 1st century, who were the priests of the eunuch. They were eunuch princes of the Elagabal. I wonder